Essentially, I wrote a book called The Liberals, which was published by HarperCollins about 4 or 5 months ago. The point of writing this book was to look at liberalization from a very personal point of view. I believe that there are two ways you can essentially look at history. You can look at what I would call the big picture history. So if, for instance, if you look at the Second World War, you could tell the history of the Second World War looking at the large battles, troop movements, deaths, all of that, military strategy. However, to me, there is one other big way of looking at history, which sometimes is perhaps the more interesting way of looking at history, which I would call the Anne Frank way of looking at history, which is you take very small incidents, you look at day-to-day lives of ordinary people, you see how their lives changed, those nuances changed, and through those little details, you bring out the larger context of how history is changing. And to me, that is a more interesting way of looking at history. The Liberals is my attempt of looking at 20 years that was definitively one of the most important times in India after independence or after the independence battle, and through the lens of a common man, through the lens of an Aam Aadmi, as it were, to see how those little details and nuances changed, and through it bring out the larger context and story of how the history of India changed, how contemporary India changed, how socio-politically this country changed. That was my attempt in The Liberals, and I am no economist, I am not a politician, nor am I a political scientist. What I am is I'm a journalist, and therefore to me human beings are most important. Therefore, when I wanted to write a book about this, I wanted to intensely, first the idea was to perhaps fictionalize it. Then I realized that the book would perhaps be most powerful and indeed be cathartic for me if I told in some senses my own story. So The Liberals is that uniquely funny thing. It's a journey of me as the primary protagonist in the book, as a middle class boy into adulthood, which coincides with 20 years of liberalization. I was about 10 at the time it began. I'm around 30 now, and this is the time when India changed. And today, all the debate in India about reaching out to a new aspiring middle class, whether it's Rahul Gandhi talking about it or Narendra Modi talking about it, they're talking about people like me, people who came of age at this particular time. They're talking about this aspiring India. And I think in some senses, I wanted to tell the tale of who we are, where we come from, where we are going or where do we want to go, and what is likely to happen to us. I see it that way because post-independence, there were a lot of interesting things that happened. India obviously was one of the first countries in the world to define its democracy in an extremely secular, holistic manner. But in terms of the country changing, in terms of real churn happening, I look at this almost like a Lego block. You see, post-independence, India remained in many ways, the Lego blocks of power remained static. I mean, the only other point where I can think of where some churn happened was, of course, with Mandal Commission and, of course, the rise of the Bahujan Samaj Party and the Dalit movement. So that was churn at a degree, in one particular space. And then there were localized sort of churns in the demand, for instance, in linguistic states and so on and so forth. But if you look at the idea of India as a whole, as a body polity, as it were, then the maximum amount of churn happened in these 20 years, because as the economy opened up, all sorts of people who never thought that they would get an opportunity, for the first time believed that they could make a difference. Which is why, for instance, if you look at post-independent India or India, after 1947, I feel that my father and my grandfather have far more in common than me and my father. As a child of liberalization, I entered India, or I have seen India as a place where there could be opportunity. There could be, ideas that I could bring about, or people like me could bring about, which would be accepted. So I believe the liberalization period is the most important and most exciting in India, for the simple reason that a whole bunch of people across India, it doesn't matter which state you come from, what language you speak, it doesn't matter what your economic background is, largely there was a sense that you could make things happen, that things were possible. And this churn to me is a very exciting churn. Now, of course, there were people who would argue that, well, you know, so many people did not get the benefit. But the fact that you're hearing all these voices come out and say, well, you know, we fell off the map of liberalization in India, we did not get enough of the benefits, to me is a very exciting thing, because in earlier times, at least according to me, you wouldn't even hear these voices. The fact that you're beginning to hear these voices come out there and say, well, you know what, we fell off the map, is a great sign of one of the, you know, kind of confidences, as it were, that liberalization brought in us. And I think that is a very exciting time. This point in time where we are speaking in 2013 is another very vital time for India. You see, I believe there are two kinds of democracies. One is a measured democracy, the other is an experienced democracy. In a measured democracy, you can of course measure once in 5 years what the democratic process is all about. Therefore, in India, once in 5 years, you can say that so many votes were cast, this was the vote swing, you know, so many parties came, this person lost, this person won. That's the measurement of democracy. I truly believe that a republic cannot truly be a secular democratic republic unless there is experienced democracy, and India doesn't have that. We don't have experienced democracy. We don't have democracy that we feel at a day-to-day level. We don't, most of us don't know who our representatives are. We don't know what they do for us. We have no control or public accounting of the money that is spent, quote unquote, in our name, in myriad ways. We don't have an experienced democracy, and to me, liberalization brought about a sense that democracy should be, ought to be, could be experienced in India. And we're at an inflection point again today where that wellspring, we're a large country, for sentiment to build up and aspiration to build up takes time. We're at that inflection point where there is a mass movement almost saying, yes, we want an experienced democracy, and how the state responds to this wellspring of thought and emotion would be how the next 20 years of India will be defined. Most of it is from only my experiences. But you see, my experiences also have to encapsulate my professional life. And in fact, the book looks at how I chose a professional life. You see, from the kind of middle-class family that I come from, there was no concept of becoming anything apart from a doctor or an engineer. My father's an engineer. Many people before that in my family have been doctors. There was no concept of being anything else apart from those two professions. And perhaps, you know, there was some newfangled thing about, you know, maybe getting an MBA or something like that. But largely when we were in school in Calcutta, the big focus was take the joint entrance, take the medical examinations. That's the way your path should go. Now, the fact that I chose a very radically different path, you know, even in journalism, I mean, when I began to write, when I first started to write about politics, for instance, simultaneously I was exploring my interest in clothing. My first two books were on luxury and fashion. I mean, even in Fortune today, I continue to write largely about the political economy, but I also once a year write the big luxury issue of Fortune. So all these choices that I made were only possible because in some senses liberalization opened up the economy, and I wanted to delve into what those choices meant for me. What did they mean for my middle class parents? How did their emotions and how did my ecosystem react to these choices that were being made? And that to me was a very fascinating journey. So when you ask how did it impact, you know, how does the story of me as a person sort of interweave with my journey as a journalist, I would argue that the fact that I chose a career like journalism, coming from the background that I do, was a, you know, breakout choice, as it were. And then in journalism, every choice that I made was a very different choice, which was largely egged on and helped by the fact that the economy was opening. Well, I definitely think that there is a huge call across India, and it doesn't matter how much you earn, what educational background you come from, where you belong. There is a call for a greater need for the people to get a share of their own say in power. Almost it's a, I would define it as the right to be heard movement. There is a right to be heard movement that is spreading across India. Even the middle classes feel that we haven't never been truly heard. And this momentum cuts across the board. You see, it's a very interesting phenomena. If you, and I travel a lot in rural areas, if you travel outside the cities, right? When you ask, and why outside the cities, even within the cities, If you go back say 5-10 years ago and you ask somebody, why are you doing this, a particular act, largely they would tell you, well, we are doing this because that's how we are, हम ऐसे ही हैं, हमारे यहाँ पे ऐसे ही होता है, it's part of our community, it's part of our samaj, we are like this only, this is how we do things, right? Largely, if today you ask people, why are you doing this, the interesting answer that often comes, at least to me, is we are doing this because आजकल ऐसे ही हो रहा है. That move from being a byproduct of a community to being a byproduct of a time is a huge leap of imagination, and I think millions across this country are taking that leap of imagination, which is why they are pushing forth for a different kind of India. And in this leap of imagination between the samaj and the samay, the community and the time, and being a byproduct of either, comes a new India, and that is really our right to be heard.